Welcome to our Beyond 20 campaign, a celebration of One Joshua Group's 20 years of service excellence. This is a One Joshua Group production, providing access to information and experts to help improve quality of life and health outcomes.
An explicit expression of social justice, because for a place like Mississippi, they felt that those items or those issues may play a major role in cardiovascular disease.
Well, thank you for joining us. You've heard the voice of Dr. Daniel Sarpong, and Dr. Sarpong was a principal investigator of the Data Coordinating Center for the Jackson Heart Study. Currently, Dr. Sarpong is the senior research scientist in the Department of General Internal Medicine, and he is the important executive director of the Office of Health Equity Research at Yale University. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Sarpong.
Thank you, Mr. Payne, for having me.
And it's always our pleasure. Now, we heard your lead-in conversation about social justice, and we want to bring our listeners, our viewers, up to speed about that. So, as the PI for the Data Coordinator Center for the Jackson Heart Study, and going back and revisit that, how important was the Jackson Heart Study in looking at issues around social justice and health disparities?
I think it was very important because there was two fundamental statements that happened 31 years apart. And the first one read that it has been discovered that health of African Americans in parts of Mississippi is deteriorating while the health standards for the nation are improving. And this was a quote that came out of Wall Street Journal in 1969. 31 years later, there was an article in circulation, one of the journals of American Heart Association, that read that cardiovascular disease among African Americans in Mississippi seems to be rising while they have fallen for the rest of the country. So this was sort of these two fundamental statements that were 31 years apart, realized that with all the significant improvements and contributions that studies like the Framingham study, MESA, CHS had made in terms of identifying biomarkers and really even influencing the management and treatment of cardiovascular disease, there was still a segment of our population, particularly in the South and Mississippi in particular, where the narrative was not good. And so it made sense for us to go to where the problem is to find the solution, because I strongly believe that wherever lies the problem, also lies the solution. So I think that's why Jackson Heart Study was very, very important. Now, because Jackson Heart Study in its uniqueness also studied or had a battery of psychosocial measures, it was, I think, implicit that social justice was important. Because at the time, the focus was all on the biomedical aspect of things, looking at biomarkers and looking at genes and the genetics. But we've all come to realize that the social drivers or structural drivers of health plays a major role. And so if we're going to address disparities or help achieve health equity, then we need to address these things, better understand them, and find solutions. So I think that's why it's so important that this Jackson Heart Study was birthed in Jackson, Mississippi.
Now, Dr. Sarpong, we're going to take a step back here. We've talked about the Jackson Heart Study. So what exactly was the Jackson Heart Study, and what was the primary goal of the Jackson Heart Study?
So the Jackson Heart Study is considered the largest single epidemiological study studying cardiovascular disease among African Americans, looking at the etiology and progression of the disease. And I think that's what the main goal of the study was, to better understand what caused folks to go from non-disease to disease as it relates to cardiovascular disease. And for those who had risk factors, how did they progress with the disease? And so that was the main focus of the Jackson Heart Study and the goal of the Jackson Heart Study. But it was unique in the sense also that most of these studies had not looked at African Americans, and particularly in the community where it was considered impoverished. Mississippi is considered a rural state. And outside a few urban centers, if you drive most directions in 30 minutes, you'll be in rural setting. And so Jackson Heart Study gave us the ability to understand the dynamics of the disease, both in urban and rural. And it also had a very diverse population or sample in terms of education, so the socioeconomic indicators, education, income, and types of occupation.
So thank you very, very much for that. And much of the information from the Jackson Heart Study certainly led to increased participation for African Americans and other minorities in clinical trials and investigation, and certainly in research. Do you believe that the Jackson Heart Study changed the way we looked at research, or do you believe Jackson Heart Study changed the way we looked at disease in minority populations?
I think the Jackson Heart Study did a few things. I think one, it sort of demystified the fact that African Americans or people of color did not want to engage in research because we were able to recruit through 5,306 individuals, of which 30% of them were part of a precursor to the Jackson Heart Study called the Atherosclerosis Risk in Communities, the ERIC study. So it showed that if a community is well engaged, there's proper dialogue, and folks' questions are answered, then folks will participate in research. I think the myth is that everybody referenced Tuskegee and then the conversation ceases. But we were able to show that we can go beyond the Tuskegee phenomenon and really answer people's questions, engage community in a meaningful way, and they'll participate in research. The interesting thing, and we call this the Canton story. Canton is about 20 miles north of Jackson, Mississippi. And the first year we sent out 200 and something letters, only 4 people signed up. And we did a massive 3 weeks to 4 weeks engagement in the community, hired 2 folks part-time to start the Community Health Advisors Network. And fast forward a year later, we had recruited over 250 people into the study, and they drove 20 miles each way to participate in a 4.5-hour exams. So it shows the power of engagement. And so I think there's a lot of things that the Jackson Heart Study, at least personally, taught me that was possible.
So I want to just again step back to the relationship of social justice. You talked about mailing out these hundreds of letters and getting a very small response to those, and then was it because you were persistent, or was it because you engaged a different group of people, or even in a different way that you were able to increase your participation from your respondents?
I think the thing was that the Jackson Heart Study also, its uniqueness, had 3 institutions as collaborators in the partnership. Jackson State, which at the time ran the Data Coordinating Center, Tougaloo College, which was the undergraduate training center, which was now developing the pipeline for future investigators, and the medical center, which was the exam center. Jackson State had good relationship with people in the community. And so therefore, with Jackson State leading the effort of community engagement, there was that trust factor. And so understanding the dynamics and the hesitance of our people, we were able to overcome that. We realized that we couldn't just buy into the myth that Black folks just didn't want to participate in research. We knew better. We just knew that we had to go with an approach that made sense. Sit and dine with them and answer their questions. And once they understood the importance of what we were doing, that they would step to the plate, and that's what happened.
A shout out to Jackson State. I guess in the current news, there's a lesson that we've learned. I didn't say football at Jackson State, that if you engage people where they are, you really come out as a winner. So much for Colorado and the other things that we're doing at Jackson State. So we do learn that if we meet people where they are,
Definitely.
that there is a way for us to win in what we're doing. Dr. Sarpong, how did you get your new position as the executive director of the Office of Health Equity Research at Yale University? How did you get from Jackson, Mississippi, which is near Canton, and also near Memphis and near other, how did you get from Jackson State University now to being the executive director at Yale University? Tell us about that journey.
Well, I think it's a very interesting journey, and my journey has never been easy. But I always say that every move I've made has been through divine intervention. So, I give credit to God for being here. Well, I was at Xavier University for 7 years, moved from being assistant professor to associate professor, then tenured. A year later, I gave up tenure to go and work at the Jackson Heart Study as a senior biostatistician, which a lot of my colleagues thought I was crazy because a lot of people do a lot to get tenure, and I got tenure. And a year later, I decided to pack my bags to take the staff position, not even the faculty position. But the 10 years I spent in the Jackson Heart Study was a wonderful 10 years of experience that I would not trade for anything. To me, I thought being marketable was more important than a false sense of security called tenure. So I packed my bags and went to Mississippi. Well, 13 years later, after working at Jackson State, 10 years at the Jackson Heart Study, and 3 more years at the RCMI Data Coordinating Center, I came back to Xavier. Xavier recruited me back to be the director of the Center for Minority Health and Health Disparities. And those 8 years was also phenomenal. It really built upon the groundwork and the foundation in health disparities and health equity that I had picked up when I was at Jackson Heart Study. And so I was able to continue that work. And I think it's true, the work that I did in the space, that maybe I was recognized as a potential. But what excites me about coming to Yale and to New Haven is because there's a strong commitment to really increase the portfolio of health equity research. So the dean is very committed. And I saw an opportunity when I visited New Haven, and I realized that this is a place I can make contribution. I think my moves to different places is how can I go in the vineyard and help labor and make it a better place than it was when I first entered. And I see that in New Haven. So I welcome the challenge. I know it's not going to be easy. I'm the new kid on the block, but I'm ready to roll my sleeves and make a difference because at the end of the day, the narrative has to change. And COVID has taught us that we've made great strides in mitigating health disparities, but we still got long ways to go. So I'm excited about the new challenge and what tomorrow holds. I don't know what it is, but I think I'm ready to roll my sleeves and I'm not afraid to fail if I should. It's all part of the contribution.
We thank you so very much for your contributions at Jackson State and at Xavier and back in the entity of the Research Centers of Minority Institutions and now at Yale. And you share something with us in this journey, Dr. Sarpong, and you mentioned this. And one is just not be afraid of work and not be afraid of hard work. And the other part about where the pipeline starts and where the pipeline can take you. And sometimes you have to give up some things to achieve other things sometimes in long term. Now, in that and along that journey where we hope that people are viewing this and looking at some career advancement opportunities that you've mentioned, your work as a biostatistician, your work in epidemiology, how would you encourage people who are interested in the research side to pursue careers in biostatistics and to have a better understanding about epidemiology?
That's a very interesting question and a very important one. I think it's a skill set that is greatly needed. Particularly in the field of public health, majoring in biostatistics or epidemiology, the market is fairly good, both industry, academia, and research intensive enterprise. So I would say that anybody with an interest in the quantitative science, interested in, not afraid with math and it's not all math, but just having analytical skills and, reasoning, it's really foundational to that work. But I think the job opportunities are better in those two fields. You get jobs easy when you major in biostatistics or epidemiology. But I always say that it's also a field where you're more in the service because you're always working with teams. And, most times you're not leading a lot of projects unless you're into the methodology or developing new methods. But I think if you feel like you're a person who doesn't mind being part of a team and doing the work, I think that's really the most critical piece. But I think what I've really enjoyed about my career in bringing biostatistics and epidemiology to the fold is that I get to work with different areas. I've done work in cardiovascular disease. I've done some work in HIV, substance abuse. I've done work in cancer. And so the sky is the limit. You just have to be teachable, willing to learn new things, and be a team player. It's not always about being the captain or the lead, but being a good follower, because even good leaders are good followers. Because when you're a leader, you're only good as long as people allow you to lead. So I think that's really fundamental. But I think most importantly, just being human, understanding human dynamics and being willing to serve and bring to bear the skills and expertise that you have to make things better or to solve problems. Yeah.
So this is Dr. Daniel Sarpong, and Dr. Sarpong is the Executive Director of the Office of Health Equity Research at Yale University, and has also been involved in the Research Centers in Minority Institutions. Now, Dr. Sarpong, can you share with us what RCMI is, what they do, and how important they are in contributing to the body of knowledge like the Jackson Heart Study?
Well, I think the RCMI, which credit goes to Sidney McNair and the Sheila McCloys of the world, that were very foundational. I mean, RCMI started under the Center for Research Resource, which later on went away, and part of the portfolio went to NIMHD. But RCMI stands for Research Centers in Minority Serving Institutions. And this is a way that resources were being put in minority serving institutions to build research capacity. I think a lot of times our institutions, particularly HBCUs or minority serving institutions, have been great contributors to the society. Sometimes we lack the infrastructure. So RCMI was a way of, trying to level a little bit of the playing field. And so I think it gives us the opportunity to contribute I think if people would go and look at contributions that RCMI institutions made during COVID, a lot of the REDX Up and the SEAL projects, you found research intensive institution collaborating with RCMI institutions to be able to reach the populations they couldn't reach by themselves and being able to make a difference in that space. So I think it plays a major role. And they said all tides flows all boats, so helping these RCMI institutions help raise the level of research at the institutions that could be a major player because they have access to the population that needs the research the most.
You've shared with us some of the pathways, and thank you for adding that minority serving in that. I think that quite often people will see the research centers in minority institutions, and their perception, as mine would have been, would change when we say the research centers in minority serving institutions. And those are Hispanic, those are with all gender, sexual orientation, all of those minority serving, the aspects of the institutions who serve those minorities. And you share with us the importance of teams and collaboration for effective accomplishments through research and minority engagement. Tell us about the community-based participatory research and how your journey highlights the importance of that.
Well, I think that for us to really make an impact in the health equity space, we definitely have to apply the principles and methods of community participatory research. I think sometimes it gets lip service because people think anything involved with community is not rigorous enough. But I think scientific rigor could still play a role. And I think also too that perception is changing, particularly after COVID, because people had realized the importance of community. The academic world may have all the technical skills. The community that's affected have the lived experience. And I go back to this whole concept of innovation, entrepreneurship and innovation. And they say that innovations are products that are developed through user design. That's the person designing out the end user. Those have higher uptake. You don't have to spend a lot of money to market those things once they are produced. And I think the user design technique really falls when we engage community in a meaningful way. They feel like they're part of it. They own it. I think that's what it is because we know we've developed a lot of interventions and we've tested them and they work. But why is it that the uptake is low? The affected were not involved in the design of these things. So they feel suspicious about the folks who did the research. And so I think the more we engage community, the way we understand how the uptake is going to be on the back end, then we can collectively develop interventions that we don't have to sell hard for people to do what they need to do. Culture is important, language is important. And sometimes I think we've developed the best tools, but we don't communicate it very well to the affected. So the uptake is low. So I think it is important. And if we're going to really make a dent in health equity or address health disparities, community has to be at the center of it. We have to acknowledge and respect the knowledge that the community with the lived experience brings to the table in the whole discovery place. But there was something that happened to me when I was in the Jackson Heart Study that really changed the way I think as a scientist. We had done a seminar on genetics because, genetics was a major component. The family study was a sub-study in the Jackson Heart Study. And we had invited Dr. Charmaine Royal, who was at Howard University, now at Duke. And she had given a talk. And after her talk, we were like in the little foyer area, hall area, just socializing. And she turned around to one of the participants in the study. She was an older lady. She was actually one of a twin. And she had also been in ERIC. And I think her sister, or the one that question was posed, was the first female city council person in Jackson, Mississippi. And she asked the lady, the participant, she says, are you all concerned about all the stuff I talked about genetics and protections and all of the legal, social implications of all of this? And she looked at Dr. Royal and said, and turned to Dr. Herman Taylor, PI at the time, and she said, I'm not worried. These folks got our back. And at that point, that resonated with me, the trust. They were putting so much trust into us as investigators. And he said, we're not worried because they'll do right by us. And so I used to tell folks that every time I had to make a decision as a scientist, while I was engaged actively with the Jackson Heart Study, I always had to remember that statement, that our decisions was not violating that trust that they had put into us. So sometimes we're too quick to rush to the finish line with discovery, that sometimes we violate that trust, but we can't do that, because once that is gone, everything is gone. So I think it's been an interesting journey, and little things like that guiding us in our work is so important. And I think if we can all do that as researchers and scientists, to pause for a moment and say, how is the community going to feel about this decision that we're making? We can still make movement, but the movement has to be guided that we're not doing it at all costs. Because in the long run, it's the payoff is not going to be good.
So our disruptive question, Dr. Sarpong, do you think that we can actually achieve social justice?
I think it's not going to be easy, because the very structures that drives this is sort of somewhat integrated into the system, right? And so I think that for us to really achieve that, it doesn't have to be an afterthought, something we have as a conversation piece every now and then. It has to be woven into the fabric of the society, that we understand and respect the contribution of all the folks that exist. Some things, but the other thing also is that sometimes we also have to understand the systems, right? All my life, every experience has not been fair, but it's okay, because I know that things are not fair, right? Right? So it's how we also respond to these things. Sometimes you have to achieve certain things to have a certain recognition. You can demand it all you want, but if you don't understand how the game is played, no matter how talented you are, your wins are going to be hit and miss. I sometimes say that the person who understands the rules of engagement will outperform the talented person who does not understand the rules of engagement, because that person is a hit and miss. But that person who understands the rules of engagement, if it's consistent, eventually will come a hit. So we have to understand the rules of engagement. And, when we think about disparities, the ugly things that come up is education, income, and we can, as a society and certain segments of the population, begin to address that. If the private prison industry is using the statistics that by fourth grade, if a child of color cannot read, they have an 80-some% chance of going to prison. Have an 80-some% chance of dropping out of high school.
Mm-hmm.
And of those who drop out of high school, 80-some% of them will end up in prison.
Right.
And they're basing their statistics in how many prisons they have to build. Why is it that we as a society is not making an effort to make sure that every child can read by the grade 4, right? At 4th grade. It's a no-brainer, right? But I mean, do we have the political will and the desire to change that? If every church decided that the parishioners' children, make sure everybody could read by grade 4, we may not have this problem.
Interesting.
But we can talk about how unfair it is and why we shouldn't be building all these prisons. But the very fundamental thing that could be fixed at the upstream is not being fixed. We're worried about complaining on the downstream end, but then, too much damage has been done. Mm-hmm. So, hopefully my contribution is helping on the upstream and not on the downstream.
Mm-hmm. So it's always our pleasure to talk with Dr. Sarpong, and he's given us a great perspective and great information. And I want to do this, and I want to tell you that you've heard from Dr. Daniel Sarpong, who is the Executive Director of the Office of Health Equity Research at Yale University. Now, I'm going to call on my friend, because we've not talked about that. I'd like to hear from the poet, Dr. Daniel Sarpong, in our closing moments for the inspiration that Daniel always gives people. You got a poem for us, Daniel, that we can close this session with?
Well, not a poem per se, but I just have a story that I want to conclude this presentation. I also want to give out a shout out to my immediate boss, Dr. Marcellus Nunes-Smith, who is the Associate Dean of Health Equity Research here at Yale University. And I have the pleasure of working under her guidance in the Office of Health Equity Research. And she was the one that brought me here. So I appreciate her guidance and also her support. But I just want to leave with a story. And the story is that there was this old man and her granddaughter, and they were walking at the beach. And the old man would every now and then bend down and he'll pick up a shellfish and he'll throw it back to the ocean. And at some point, the granddaughter said, "Well, Grandpa, why are you doing all this? There's so many shellfish is being washed today, and they're going to die. So why are you bothering? Throwing this one in and that one in." And he never said a mumbling word. Took a few steps, bent down, picked up another shellfish, and threw it back in the ocean. Turned to the granddaughter and says, "But for this one, it gets to live." We may not solve all the problems, but the little problem that we can each solve, let's do that. Because for that, will make a difference. Thank you.
Well, thank you so very much. We've listened to wisdom, we've listened to wit, and most of all, inspiration. And you get all of that rolled into one person. And I'll tell you that although he is the executive director of the Office of Health Equity Research at Yale University, he's an all-around good guy. So that's Dr. Daniel Sarpong. Thank you so very much for joining us, Dr. Sarpong. And remember, if all of us can, that if you send out 2 invitations and only 4 people come to the party, if you're persistent enough, you can get all 200 of people to come to the party if you meet people where they are. Thank you so very much, and thank you for joining us as we celebrate our 20th anniversary and beyond. Be kind, be compassionate, and continue to watch us as we move forward in our future. Thank you again, Dr. Sarpong.
Thank you, and thanks for having me, and keep the great work that you're doing through One Joshua Group and all the great things that you're doing, and may God bless you and your organization.
Thank you so very much, and thank each of you.
This edition of Beyond 20 is a Life Beat podcast sponsored by One Joshua Group, your strategic source of engagement to improve life through better health, education, and information. For more information, visit us at theonejoshuagroup.com or follow our work on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter using hashtag OneJGCollabs. One Joshua Group, building capacity, expanding resources, joining what you know with what we've learned.